In this lecture, we'll look at circulatory changes during dynamic exercise and blood flow to the brain and skin. We're first going to look at circulatory changes that occur during dynamic exercise. Dynamic exercise refers to exercises that involve changes in joint angles, as opposed to static exercises such as isometric exercises. There are two equations that you need to understand the circulatory changes that occur during exercise. The first one is blood flow equals delta P over resistance, which we've introduced earlier. We can use this equation in two ways. We can use it to understand cardiac output. So cardiac output is blood flow, so we could substitute cardiac output here. And for delta P, we could substitute mean arterial pressure, and for resistance, we can substitute total peripheral resistance. Therefore, cardiac output equals mean arterial pressure over total peripheral resistance. So any change in, for example, an increase in mean arterial pressure would lead to an increase in cardiac output. An increase in resistance or total peripheral resistance would lead to a decrease in cardiac output. And an increase in a decrease in total peripheral resistance would lead to an increase in cardiac output. Additionally, there's a second equation, which is very useful, which is this one, delta P. It's the same equation as this one, just rearranged. We're multiplying each side by resistance. Delta P equals blood flow multiplied by resistance. Now we can use this to look at mean arterial pressure. So delta P is in fact we can substitute in mean arterial pressure. The way we can do this because we can assume that the pressure at the right atrium is effectively 0 millimeters of mercury. So MAP equals blood flow. Blood flow would be cardiac output multiplied by total peripheral resistance. This means that if, let's say there's a decrease in total peripheral resistance, which occurs during exercise as arterioles and skeletal muscles vasodilate, in order to maintain the same mean arterial pressure, we'd have to have an increase in blood flow, meaning that the cardiac output would have to increase. Okay, so during exercise, there's a need for more blood flow to certain organs, such as active skeletal muscle. So how do we get to that point? How do we get more blood flow to through a particular organ? Well, we can use this equation. Blood flow equals delta P divided by resistance. So the delta P would be the mean arterial pressure. So that's a possibility, right? You could increase mean arterial pressure, and that would certainly increase blood flow. And that does happen to a certain degree. So mean arterial pressure increases by about 20 to 30% as someone exercises very intensely. The systolic pressure actually increases quite a bit more, but the diastolic pressure doesn't increase by very much during even very intense exercises. So you can ask the question, well, why doesn't it increase more than that? Why are we limited to about 20 to 30% increase in mean arterial pressure? Well, the reason is, say you doubled it or tripled the mean arterial pressure, now you're getting into a range in which you might start bursting blood vessels, you might start damaging organs and so forth. So the other way of increasing blood flow, is you can see in this equation, is you could maintain, say you maintain the mean arterial pressure more or less constant. Well, you could decrease resistance. And that's the strategy that your body uses. So when you have very active skeletal muscles, in order to get enough blood flow through those muscles, you have a tremendous drop in the resistance to blood flow. And that comes about through the dilation of arterioles, leading to the capillary beds within the skeletal muscle. So in addition to all this, there will be vasodilation in arterioles in some organs during exercise. This will increase the blood flow through those organs. And at the same time, we'll have vasoconstriction in other organs to help direct the blood flow. So for example, when we're exercising, we don't really need to have as much blood flow through the GI tract or to the kidneys. And so blood flow will decrease as a percentage of the total output of the heart, the total cardiac output. As the intensity of exercise increases, the amount of oxygen a person uses increases. And that's shown on the x-axis here in this graph. So essentially at 100% VO2 max, this means the person is using oxygen at the highest rate they possibly can for that particular individual. And what you can see here is the systolic pressure goes up as we step up the exercise. The person is exercising on a exercise bike. The systolic pressure goes up. The diastolic pressure actually remains relatively steady, actually might decrease a little bit at the higher intensities of exercise. But look at the mean arterial pressure. It goes up, but then it levels off at around perhaps around 20 to 30% above the resting mean arterial pressure. So at the most intense levels of exercise, MAP is only increased by about 20, perhaps 30%. At the same time, the total peripheral resistance has decreased to about half its resting value. That's not shown in the graph, but that was in the paper that I took this graph from. What causes the decrease in total peripheral resistance? The decrease in total peripheral resistance is a result of decreased vascular resistance in the skeletal muscle vascular beds. So again, this would be, in this case, this person's on an exercise bike, so mostly it's the arterioles and the skeletal muscle of the legs that will be activated. And they would be vasodilated, and therefore there's a decrease in resistance in those vascular beds. But they make up such a substantial portion of the vascular beds that the blood flow would go to, the cardiac output would go to, that it has this very significant effect on the total peripheral resistance of the person. During exercise, there's a decrease in the resistance to blood flow through skeletal muscle. Because the skeletal muscles make up a large portion of the systemic circuit, this decrease leads to a large drop in the total vascular resistance. If cardiac output were to remain constant during exercise, what would happen to MAP? MAP will drop, potentially causing a loss of perfusion of organs such as the brain. So this is a big problem. So actually, it turns out your cardiovascular system is really well tuned, such that when you have a decrease in peripheral resistance, total peripheral resistance, there's almost always a corresponding increase in cardiac output, such that the mean arterial pressure remains more or less constant. As we've discussed previously, when a person starts to exercise, or say they're in a fight or flight situation, you'd expect changes in autonomic output. So for example, there'd be an increase in sympathetic output and a decrease in parasympathetic output. At the same time, there are also feedback loops. For example, with venous return increasing, you might get an increase in heart rate. But it turns out some of these adjustments occur so quickly. They really occur faster than you'd predict based on negative feedback loops and some of the things I just discussed. So it turns out that the motor cortex sends out signals. And the motor cortex, of course, is generating the pattern motor output that leads to running, say. At the same time, it's also sending motor information out that leads to the increase in cardiac output, and also at the same time an increase in breathing rate and depth. In addition, so that's essentially a motor signal. So it's a central command signal that's telling the body, okay, you're now exercising, so we need to increase cardiac output. At the same time, the contracting muscles actually have sensors, which are called proprioceptors. They're sensors that pay attention to things like muscle length and tension, and they'll send feedback to the brain. And those get activated very quickly as soon as someone starts running. And so that's a very quick feedback loop that leads to cardiovascular adjustments. And finally, of course, say we do have this large decrease in total peripheral resistance. This could potentially lead to a decrease in mean arterial pressure. So we also have baroreceptors, which are pressure receptors, which are in the aorta as well as in the carotid arteries. And they send feedback very quickly to the brain. And so those make very quick adjustments to the cardiac output. So the combined result of the central command plus the sensory feedback is an increase in sympathetic nervous activity and a decrease in parasympathetic nervous activity. And this has this very quick cardio effect in terms of changing cardiovascular output. Blood flow through exercising muscles increases due to an increase in cardiac output. And this is going to be due to an increase in heart rate primarily, but also somewhat also due to an increase in stroke volume. This blood flow increase occurs because of metabolic vasodilation of active muscles. This refers to the idea that the active muscle fibers release potassium and adenosine and CO2 and other metabolic factors, and sometimes there are also some signaling molecules that are released. And this leads to vasodilation of the arterioles that lead to the capillaries feeding these muscles. And so therefore there's increased blood flow. At the same time, in order to allow for this increased blood flow through the active exercising muscles, there's diversion of blood flow away from viscera, such as the GI tract and the liver, and also away from skin. Now, if we look at the brain, blood flow actually increases a small amount during moderate exercise. And that's a good thing. You know, when you exercise, you will have a slight increase in blood flow, which is always a nice thing. And that makes sense because there's a slight increase in mean arterial pressure, so you might expect at least a small increase in blood flow to the brain. Now, as the level of exercise intensity goes up, eventually when you get to very intense exercises, there's actually a decrease in blood flow to the brain. And the reason for this is because as you're exercising, you have to breathe deeper and faster. And as you do that, you bring in air, which of course has a very low amount of CO2 compared to the CO2 in your pulmonary capillaries. And what you're doing is essentially refreshing that air so much that you decrease the CO2 in the alveolar airspace. And therefore you increase the difference in pressure, partial pressure of CO2, such that it's lower within the alveolar airspace compared to the pulmonary capillaries. And by ventilating a lot, you've made it even lower. And so this means that you're able to offload or get rid of CO2 very quickly when you're breathing so fast and so deeply. And as you get rid of CO2, what happens is this makes the blood more alkaline. So the pH goes up. And when the pH goes up, this has an effect on the arterioles within the brain. They vasoconstrict. And so there's a reduction in blood flow to the brain because of this. And it's possible you may have experienced this. If you're exercising very intensely, like saying doing a sprint, well, you may feel a bit lightheaded. And so this is part of the reason why you feel so lightheaded. It's because of this vasoconstriction and therefore a reduction in blood flow to the brain, either immediately during the intense exercise or sometimes you feel lightheaded immediately afterwards. During intense exercise, cardiac output can increase 5 times due to an increase in cardiac rate primarily. Now, if we look at stroke volume, that also does increase. So we can see in this graph, for example, that stroke volume increases. What's seen on the x-axis is the intensity of the exercise. So at 100%, that's the 100% of the essentially the ability of a person to use up oxygen. So 25% is kind of a light exercise. By the time you get to about 40%, you're getting into more moderate level exercise. And the stroke volume actually increases up to about that point, and then from then on it plateaus. So why would stroke volume be expected to change at all? Well, first of all, as you increase the heart rate, that there's less time spent in diastole. And so recall that in order to fill the ventricles, that takes time. And you end up with a certain end diastolic volume. And that's due to the passive filling. And also you have the atrial kick in which the atria contract and push extra blood into the ventricles. So you might expect actually stroke volume might actually decrease. So because the filling time has decreased. However, there are some things that offset that fact that the filling time has decreased. First of all, when you're exercising, let's say the person's running, then their skeletal muscle pump will be very active and very effective at pumping blood back to the heart. So remember, the skeletal muscle pump consists of these little chambers formed by one-way valves in major veins within the legs and arms. And when skeletal muscles push on those little chambers formed by those one-way valves, they help propel blood back towards the heart. So that becomes much more effective as the person is exercising more intensely. And at the same time, as you increase the intensity of the exercise, you have more respiratory movements. And that also works because there's the respiratory muscle pump, which actually also helps to bring blood back from the abdominal cavity within the inferior vena cava up to the thoracic cavity and then into the heart. Okay, but it does, so initially there's a lot of this increased venous return due to the skeletal muscle pump and the respiratory movements. And that does help increase the stroke volume. And there also may be some increases in heart contractility that will also help with stroke volume. However, you see that it does plateau. And this plateaus because there's basically a limit to how strong these contractions can be in most individuals. And so you do get to a point where it does plateau, and that's because, going back to the idea that there's limited time as the heart rate increases, as the intensity of the exercise increases, there's less and less time for passive filling of the ventricles. Okay, moving on. The next thing is ejection fraction. So ejection fraction is the amount of blood that's ejected, which is the stroke volume, divided by the end diastolic volume. So typically, that's only about 60% when you're at rest, meaning that about 40% or so of the blood is left within the ventricles. It never gets ejected during the ejection phase of systole. However, if you're exercising very intensely, then there is increased heart contractility due to norepinephrine being released at synapses onto the myocardium, and also due to epinephrine being released and acting as a hormone, again on the myocardium, increasing muscle contractility. So the ejection fraction can actually increase to 90%, which is actually pretty remarkable because that means there's only 10% blood left within the ventricles, 10% of that first end diastolic volume. And so this increase in ejection fraction is largely due to increased contractility of the heart. There are a number of changes that occur in the body as a person does endurance training. The first is they'll have a lower resting cardiac rate, and this is due to greater inhibition of the SA node by the parasympathetic nervous system. Accompanying this lower cardiac rate is an increase in stroke volume. This increase in stroke volume occurs because there's an increase in blood volume, and this, of course, aids in venous return, leading to an end diastolic volume that's greater, and that leads to greater heart contraction force due to Starling's law, Frank Starling law of the heart, which we discussed earlier. And there also may be a training effect there too. As the person trains, their heart may get stronger, and they have increased heart contractility due to the training itself. So the outcome of all this is that there's going to be an increase in cardiac output, which improves O2 delivery, both at rest and during exercise. This diagram summarizes some of the things we've been talking about. At rest, the cardiac output of a standard typical person is about 5 liters per minute, with a large portion going to the GI tract and the liver, so the viscera, a certain percentage, 4 to 5%, going to the heart, 20% going to the kidney, 3 to 5% to the bones, 15% to the brain, 4 to 5% to the skin, and 15 to 20% to skeletal muscle. During heavy exercise, a typical healthy person can increase their cardiac output by 5 times. So now instead of 5 liters per minute, it's 25 liters per minute. And now if we look at the percentages, now the liver and the GI tract take up much less of the total output, so only about 3 to 5%. The heart stays at 4 to 5%, but recall that the overall cardiac output is increased by 5 times. So this means that the heart is in fact receiving 5 times more blood than it was at rest. The kidneys now only receive about 2 to 4% of the total cardiac output. The bones only 0.5 to 1% of the total cardiac output. The brain actually decreases to only 3 to 4% of the total cardiac output. But again, you have to imagine that you have to essentially multiply this by 5 because there's 5 times more blood flowing. So it's actually In terms of actual blood flow, it hasn't really changed very much. In fact, it may have increased slightly. And that's under sort of standard exercise. If you have really intense exercise, even more, it may actually decrease. Okay. And then for the skin, it doesn't actually say here, and I think this is just an error in the figure, but initially when someone starts to exercise, there's actually less blood flow to the skin. And that's because of sympathetic output. So sympathetic output acting on releasing norepinephrine, acting on adrenergic receptors will typically lead to vasoconstriction. And so that's what happens initially when someone starts exercising. Of course, things change and we'll talk about skin more in more detail later, so I won't go into too much detail here. But as the person starts to heat up, their core body temperature increases. Then there's a real need for more blood flow to the skin to dissipate this excess heat. And so that at that point, later on during the exercise, the blood flow to the skin may become quite high. And then if we look at skeletal muscle, it's now, instead of being 15 to 20% of the total cardiac output, it's now 80 to 85%. And that makes sense because the person's doing really intense exercise. This diagram summarizes some of the things we've been discussing. During exercise, there's increased blood flow to skeletal muscles, as you can see here. And this is due to metabolic vasodilation in muscle. So the active muscles release potassium and adenosine and other things that lead to dilation of the smooth muscle encircling arterioles within skeletal muscles. That helps decrease the resistance to blood flow. And this effect is so large that there has to be a corresponding increase in cardiac output, because this actually decreases the total peripheral resistance so dramatically. Going back here, this also, at the same time that there's this increase in blood flow to the skeletal muscles, there's sympathetic vasoconstriction in the viscera. So there's less blood flow to the GI tract, for example. And also initially during exercise, a decrease in blood flow to the skin. Now, if we look at cardiac output, this increases due to an increase in primarily cardiac rate, but also to some degree also there's an increase in stroke volume, which is helpful. But as we discussed earlier, that effect plateaus at about 40% of maximal utilization of oxygen. The things that affect cardiac rate and stroke volume are the sympathoadrenal system. So the sympathetic nervous system releases norepinephrine at synapses at the sinoatrial node. That increases the cardiac rate. There are also synapses from the sympathetic nervous system directly onto the myocardium in both the atria and the ventricles. And this increases contractility of the atria and the ventricles, and this helps to increase stroke volume also. Stroke volume is also affected by improved venous return. So during exercise, there's increased skeletal muscle activity. This leads to more blood flowing back through the skeletal muscle pumps to the heart. So that's improved venous return. And also deeper breathing also improves venous return through the respiratory pump. This table summarizes some of the things we've talked about that occur during moderate exercise. Cardiac output increases due to increased cardiac rate and stroke volume. Cardiac rate increases because of increased sympathetic nerve activity and decreased activity of the vagus nerve, which of course contains the parasympathetic fibers. Stroke volume increases. This is due to increased myocardial contractility, due to stimulation of the sympathoadrenal system. It also may increase due to increased venous return, which isn't here in this chart. And there's also a decrease in total peripheral resistance. Now, this one's a little harder to explain. Recall that during exercise, mean arterial pressure may go up at least moderately, maybe by 20%. Now, that mean arterial pressure can be considered in some ways as an afterload. So the heart has to push against that mean arterial pressure when it is ejecting blood. So if we didn't decrease the total peripheral resistance as much as we do due to the increased vasodilation of the skeletal muscles, then the mean arterial pressure would be much higher than it actually is during exercise. Let's say it increased to, say, 200 millimeters of mercury, something really outrageous. Then that would make it much more hard. I mean, the afterload would be much higher, and the work of the heart would be more difficult. And so this decreased total peripheral resistance actually does help with increasing the stroke volume. Okay, the total peripheral resistance decreases, and this is due to vasodilation of arterioles and skeletal muscles. And additionally, once the core body temperature increases enough, then we'll have vasodilation of the arterioles within the skin. And this is actually pretty significant. This will actually also lead to a decrease in total peripheral resistance. During exercise, the mean arterial pressure does increase a bit. This increased systolic and pulse pressure is primarily due to increased cardiac output. Diastolic pressure rises less due to decreased total peripheral resistance. End diastolic volume is unchanged. This is due to decreased filling time at high cardiac rates. Now it's a little complicated again because there is decreased filling time, but that's compensated for by an increase in venous pressure or venous return, and that's due to the activity of the skeletal muscle pump and the respiratory pump, which also aids in venous return. Finally, okay, there's increased blood flow to the heart and muscles, and this is because increased muscle metabolism produces intrinsic vasodilation, and this is aided by increased cardiac output and increased vascular resistance in visceral organs. So we've discussed all that previously. Blood flow to visceral organs is decreased. This is due to vasoconstriction of the digestive tract, the liver, and the kidneys. And this is all due to sympathetic nerve stimulation. Blood flow to the skin is increased. Now, I said it was decreased, but it actually does increase eventually once the person's been exercising for a while. At that point, metabolic heat produced by exercising muscles produces reflex involving the hypothalamus that reduces sympathetic constrictions of the arterial venous shunts and arterioles. And we're going to discuss this more in slides in the future. Blood flow to the brain is unchanged, and this is due to autoregulation of cerebral vessels, which maintains constant cerebral blood flow despite increased arterial pressure. And that's something we'll also discuss more in a subsequent slide. We'll next look in some detail at blood flow in the brain and skin. In this section of the lecture, we're going to compare two different organs. We're going to compare the brain and the skin because they're quite different in terms of blood flow and blood flow control. The cerebral blood flow is primarily controlled by intrinsic mechanisms and is relatively constant. And the reason for this is the brain can't tolerate much variation in blood flow. So, for example, if you have even a small decrease in blood flow, this will lead to fainting, as demonstrated here. This looks like a sort of fake fainting. And with the skin, however, you have cutaneous blood flow primarily controlled by extrinsic mechanisms, and it shows much more variation. And part of the reason for this is your skin is able to handle different rates of blood flow without much trouble. And here's an example of localized blood flow. This person is blushing, and so they have a lot of blood flow to the surface levels of the skin. Cerebral circulation is held relatively constant at about 750 milliliters per minute. This really doesn't change very much between, say, rust and other states. So it will increase, as we talked about earlier. During exercise, it may increase a bit, and eventually, if you're doing very intense exercise, it may decrease. But generally, it's going to be held at about that value. So unless the mean arterial pressure becomes very high, then there's very little sympathetic control of blood flow to the brain. At high pressures, let's say 200 millimeters of mercury, and that's a point where you can actually have damage of these very delicate vessels in the brain. Then vasoconstriction occurs due to the sympathetic control, and that helps to protect small blood vessels from damage and stroke. As I mentioned in the previous slide, if there's very high blood pressure, there may be sympathetic control of blood vessels in the brain, vasoconstriction, which helps to protect these very delicate blood vessels. However, most of the time, the brain takes care of its own vasodilation and constriction through intrinsic mechanisms. One intrinsic mechanism is called myogenic regulation. When the blood pressure falls, cerebral blood vessels automatically dilate. So they're essentially measuring pressure, and so when the pressure drops, they dilate, and this leads to increased blood flow. If the pressure increases, this is again detected within the blood vessels, then the blood vessels protect themselves by constriction, and this therefore decreases the flow of blood through the brain. Now, another thing that the brain pays attention to is changes in the pH of the cerebral spinal fluid. So, for example, if the pH decreases, this means there's been a buildup of CO2, and we can see why that is based on this equation. If there's increased CO2, then the CO2 can collide with water, forming carbonic acid, which isn't shown here. But then the carbonic acid can then break apart into bicarbonate, which is shown here, and hydrogen ion. So an increase in CO2 will drive the forward reaction rate to be faster than the backward reaction rate. And therefore, you'll have an increase in hydrogen ion concentration within the cerebral spinal fluid, and that means that the pH will decrease. And so this decrease in pH leads to arterial dilation, which will lead to an increase in blood flow through the brain. So why would the CO2 level change? Well, it could be a case of hypoventilation. Perhaps the person is sick, or there's some reason they're not ventilating enough to keep up with the metabolic needs of the body. Potentially, this buildup in CO2 could also be local within the brain. Perhaps there isn't enough. For some reason, there's not adequate blood flow to the brain due to an occlusion of an artery or something like that. Now, the opposite can also happen. You can have an increase in pH of the cerebral spinal fluid, and this would be due to a drop in CO2. Again, we can look at this. If there's less CO2, then this would lead to less interaction between CO2 and water, less formation of carbonic acid, which can break into bicarbonate and hydrogen ion. And of course, the hydrogen ion and bicarbonate can combine, forming carbonic acid, which can then split apart into CO2 and water. So basically, if there's less CO2, then this reverse reaction rate is favored over the forward reaction rate. And therefore, there would be a decrease in hydrogen ions in the cerebral spinal fluid, and this would correspond to an increase in pH. And this increase in pH is detected by the blood vessels in the brain, and you have vasoconstriction. And so this can actually happen. There could be multiple reasons, but if say someone's very anxious, they may start to hyperventilate, meaning that they're ventilating more than they need to meet the metabolic needs. Okay, and so when you do that, you're breathing faster and you're replenishing the air within the alveolar airspace, and you drop the CO2 level in the alveolar airspace. This means you have more rapid diffusion of CO2 out of the pulmonary arteries. The pulmonary capillaries into the alveolar airspace. And so you essentially will drop the arterial CO2 levels. And again, that will lead to an increase in the pH of the arterial blood. And then this leads to vasoconstriction of the blood vessels within the brain. And then this leads to decreased blood flow through the brain. And therefore, the person feels lightheaded and they may even faint. And so this is something you may experience. It can also occur sometimes even with exercise. If you're exercising and you're breathing very deeply due to the exercise, right afterwards, there may be a little bit of an imbalance unless you continue to breathe really deeply, and you continue to offload a lot of CO2. And then at that point, after the exercise is done, you've finished sprinting or whatever, you now feel a bit lightheaded, and that's because of this vasoconstriction effect that occurs in the brain. Another form of intrinsic regulation within the brain that's very important is called metabolic regulation. In this type of regulation, the most active regions of the brain receive increased blood flow called hyperemia. And this is due to the sensitivity of the arterioles within the brain to metabolic changes. Active neurons release potassium, adenosine, nitric oxide, and other chemicals that cause vasodilation. So for example, if we look at this picture here, this person is in a machine. It's an MRI machine or magnetic resonance imaging machine. And the signal they're looking at is called BOLD, for blood oxygenation level dependent. And so basically, wherever you see an increase in activity in the image, that corresponds to increased blood flow. Well, and so the idea is that that would be where the active neurons are. So this person, just to orient ourselves, here, of course, is the cerebrum. Here's the cerebellum. Looks like this is probably the eye socket. So this person is imaging various, seeing various images, which they change every 30 seconds. And when the image changes, then there's greater activation of the visual cortex back here. And you can see that here with this false colored image. And so this gives you an idea of which areas are active. So the point is that not all of the brain is active all at the same time. There's different parts that are activated depending on the tasks that you're doing. And actually, I put this image down here because I thought it was kind of interesting. So there are certain natural scenes that we've probably all experienced when we go to the beach and we see enormous waves or something like that. And these are kind of stimulating, right? They're kind of activate your brain and make you excited. And the reason I think is that it's activating the visual cortex very, very much. And so it's very interesting. Now, in addition to neurons, we now know that astrocytes also release signaling molecules. So again, astrocytes are support cells, and they help neurons metabolically and so forth. And we've discussed that previously. But now it's not actually known that they release signaling molecules that can also lead to vasodilation. So for example, they can release prostaglandins and carbon monoxide, both of which will lead to vasodilation within blood vessels in the brain. Unlike the brain, which is very intolerant of large fluctuations in blood flow, the skin can tolerate lots of fluctuations in blood flow. The skin helps to control body temperature in a changing environment by regulating blood flow. So, for example, there may be situations in which we have increased blood flow to capillaries in the skin, and this essentially brings heat from the core of our body towards the surface, and then we can the heat can then be conducted and radiated away from our body and into the environment. In addition, the skin contains sweat glands, and these can produce sweat, which is able to cool our body through evaporative cooling. So we'll talk about each of these topics in a little more detail. Let's imagine that you're in a very cold environment. You need to maintain your core body temperature. How does your body go about doing that? Well, one way is to have less blood flow to the superficial parts of your body, including the skin. And so you'll have vasoconstriction of arterioles in the skin. And this you can see here in this picture here, these are arterioles. So if these can vasoconstrict, then there's going to be more resistance and therefore less blood flow through the skin. Now, this is aided by the fact you have these arterial venous anastomoses, and these can actually shunt blood from the arterioles directly to the venules. And therefore, the blood doesn't go into these more superficial capillary loops within the skin. How does your body do this? Well, cold temperature activates the sympathetic nervous system, and the sympathetic nervous system has fibers that release norepinephrine. These act on adrenergic receptors. And the general effect of this is vasoconstriction. So this is tolerated in the skin because their skin is able to decrease its metabolic activity. And so when there's a decrease in blood flow, there's a decrease in metabolic activity of the skin. The skin is okay with that. It's very different from the brain, which always has a very high metabolic activity no matter what. The skin is actually able to reduce its metabolic activity to match this reduced blood flow. Based on what we just discussed in the previous slide, it would be logical that this would mean that when you're out in the cold in the winter, then you should have a very pallid tint to your skin. It should be very white because there's less blood flow. But actually, we often experience the opposite, which is that kids, for example, have very rosy cheeks in the winter. So what would cause this? Well, when the temperature is low, the sympathetic nerves stimulate cutaneous vasoconstriction. So this does, in fact, decrease the overall quantity of blood flow to the skin. However, if you look in detail at this, you can see that these anastomoses also can constrict. So they're encircled by smooth muscle. They constrict. And if they constrict, then you actually have diversion of blood into these more superficial capillary loops, which are really just very right below, the epidermis and so forth. And so that becomes very visual. You can see that this person has a lot of blood flow to those very superficial capillary loops, and that shows up as these rosy cheeks, which is, of course, very cute. Okay, we've gone from the cold. Let's imagine this person has come back inside, and now we're back at just a normal room temperature. So at this point, vascular resistance in the skin is high and the blood flow is low. And sympathetic activity is the main reason for this. There's sympathetic activity. There's nerves that are active. They're releasing norepinephrine. They're acting on adrenergic receptors, causing vasoconstriction, which reduces blood flow to the skin. Now, however, let's imagine this person's come inside, but now they're on a treadmill. They start to run, and their internal core temperature increases. Now, this is going to lead to decreased activity of the adrenergic sympathetic axon. So now they're releasing less norepinephrine, leading to less vasoconstriction. At the same time, there's going to be an increase in activity of the cholinergic sympathetic axons. These release acetylcholine. Acetylcholine promotes vasodilation. They act on muscarinic receptors in the smooth muscle surrounding the arterioles. So now we're going to get vasodilation in the skin, and this is good because we want to offload this heat. So now we're bringing a lot of blood to the surface of the body in the skin, and that allows the heat to dissipate into the environment. At the same time, the cholinergic sympathetic axons also stimulate sweat glands. This is a very well-known phenomenon in humans, and these sweat glands secrete. So that's, of course, good because you now have a layer of sweat on the body, and you have evaporative cooling. The molecules of sweat that have the highest of water in the sweat that have the highest amount of energy leave the body, and as they leave, they take heat away from the body. The sweat glands secrete bradykinins, which stimulates vasodilation of the skin also. We're going to end this section on cutaneous blood flow by pulling together some of the things we've talked about. So when we talked about exercise, recall that as a person is exercising, they have the motor cortex, which is very active, sending commands to the arms and legs. At the same time, it sends powerful central commands to the cardiac control center in the brainstem. And this activates the sympathetic nervous system, which causes an increase in heart rate as well as stroke volume due to contractility of the heart, increased contractility of the heart. So that's one thing that's driving an increase in cardiac output. There's also changes such as there's sensory feedback, for example, from proprioceptors within muscle. So these proprioceptors detect changes in muscle length and muscle tension. So as someone's running, those are very active. They're sending input to the cardiac control center within the brainstem. And of course, there's also baroreceptors that pay attention to mean arterial pressure. They're sending input and so forth. So there's a lot of things that would maintain the cardiac output. Okay, now imagine this person's running and it's very hot and humid. So now they're running and they're sweating and there's a lot of
blood flow to the skin as well as to skeletal muscle. So this means that the arterioles in the skin are vasodilated. And again, that would also lead to a decrease in total peripheral resistance, but that's more than compensated by, it's more compensated by the increase in cardiac output. Okay, now imagine the person stops running. Almost immediately, the skeletal muscles will change such that the arterioles will vasoconstrict because the skeletal muscles are not as active, so they'll change. They don't need as much blood flow, and so they'll compensate for that. However, for heat, that's something that doesn't go away very quickly. If you're really overheated, then that can take quite a long time to get rid of that excess heat. But the problem that arises is that will maintain the total peripheral resistance relatively low because of all the blood flow through the skin. But a lot of the inputs to the cardiac control center, the brainstem, are no longer going to be there. The motor cortex is centering fewer central commands saying, hey, I'm running to the cardiac control center. There won't be that proprioceptive feedback from the active skeletal muscles in the arms and legs. You'll still have feedback from the baroreceptors, so it's not that it all goes away, but a good proportion of the stimulus to the cardiac control center will disappear, as if a person just stops exercising very quickly. And so that means there may be an imbalance. The total peripheral resistance is still very low, but the cardiac output isn't maintained as high as it should be. Recall that mean arterial pressure equals cardiac output multiplied by total peripheral resistance. So if the total peripheral resistance is very low and the cardiac output isn't correspondingly high, then the mean arterial pressure may drop. And this may lead to dizziness, and the person may feel weak, and they may even faint. And so again, this can be very dangerous. It could even be life-threatening. So again, this is just something to be aware of. You should keep hydrated. If the person's really overheated, find ways to cool off. Potentially another way also to combat this really quite dangerous situation is potentially doing a cool down. So in other words, continue to run, but just at a slower pace. And as you do that, you'll continue to sweat and lose some of the heat. But you'll also keep up the input to the cardiac control center that was maintaining the cardiac output relatively high. So there's probably a number of different strategies, and I don't actually know what the best one is, but there certainly can be quite dangerous if you're running in a very hot, humid environment, which your core body temperature is increased, and then if you just suddenly stop running, that could really be quite dangerous. Okay, finally, another thing that's quite interesting is emotions can affect sympathetic activity, and this can cause one of two effects. One is you can have a very pale complexion or pallor, and this actually makes sense because we know sympathetic release of norepinephrine acting on adrenergic receptors will generally lead to vasoconstriction, and so that would lead to less blood flow to the skin and therefore a pallid visage or face. And but the other opposite thing is blushing, where you have a lot of blood flow to the skin. And this is also stimulated by sympathetic nervous activity. And we know that because there's been many studies. What's less well known is exactly how the sympathetic nervous system is causing blushing. It's possible that the norepinephrine is acting on different receptors. Who knows? Potentially there might be other neurotransmitters involved. But anyway, that's an interesting open subject.